Michael had the world at his feet, or at least that's how it seemed. To society, he was the self-made millionaire who had built his empire with sweat, boldness, and a touch of brilliance. But what no one saw was the weight of wearing success like armor. It protected him, but it also isolated him. Every detail of his life was carefully calculated, from the car he drove to the words he chose in a casual conversation. Nothing escaped his attention, or almost nothing. His business partner, Richard, was the key to the equation. If Michael was the charismatic leader who inspired others, Richard was the meticulous strategist who kept everything running smoothly behind the scenes. They had known each other since college, back when the idea of owning a multi-million-dollar company seemed as far away as the stars. And yet, here they were, sharing control of an empire. For Michael, his daily routine was a high-performance game. He was up before dawn, reviewing reports and sitting through back-to-back meetings, as if time were his greatest adversary. He lived by the saying, "Time is money," but acted as if time were gold, precious and irreplaceable. Yet somewhere between the meetings and flights, he had lost the joy that once made him love what he did. Though he would never admit it, he felt like something was missing. The mansion he called home was a reflection of his success. Massive, impressive, and eerily quiet. Michael often said that solitude was the price of power, but he failed to realize that the silence was starting to weigh on him. He had everything a man could want, yet sometimes he wondered if it was truly enough. His moments of doubt were rare, but when they came, they arrived like a whisper he couldn't ignore. What if you lose it all tomorrow? That morning, Michael was restless. Opening a new branch was a huge challenge, and he loved challenges. The helicopter ride was just another chapter in his busy routine. As he adjusted his tie and grabbed his flawless leather briefcase, he glanced out the window and saw the sun rising on the horizon. To him, it was a good omen. He didn't believe in luck, only in hard work, and he was certain that today would be yet another example of how dedication triumphs over adversity. The helicopter ascended, slicing through the sky with the precision of something familiar with its route. Michael settled into the leather seat, watching as the city below shrank away. There was something almost poetic about seeing everything from above, as if he truly were the master of the world. He glanced at his watch, a reflex born of his restless mind. There was still time to review the details of the meeting as the pilot kept the flight steady. The hum of the cabin was broken only by the rhythmic sound of the rotor blades, a steady pulse that brought a deceptive sense of security. Michael leaned forward to grab his briefcase, but was interrupted by a slight jolt. At first, he thought it was turbulence, common enough for someone who traveled frequently. But the pilot's tense expression told a different story. A flicker of unease crossed Michael's mind, though he didn't let it show. Another jolt, harder this time. Michael's briefcase slipped from his hands, scattering papers across the floor. He despised unpredictability, and this particular incident felt like a personal affront. "What's going on?" he asked, striving to maintain his composure, though the demanding tone in his voice was unmistakable. The pilot pressed buttons with measured urgency, muttering something about an unusual system failure. The helicopter began to lose altitude. It wasn't a sudden drop, but a gradual descent that Michael, attuned to controlling every variable, noticed immediately. He gripped the armrest, his eyes fixed on the dashboard. The pilot, though clearly experienced, radiated an uncommon tension. "We're looking for a place to land," he said, though his words felt more like a prayer than a plan. Below them, the landscape shifted between open fields and dense rows of trees. Michael could tell the pilot was doing his best to avoid disaster, but he also knew a safe landing would be no easy feat. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. Panic had never served him before, and he wasn't about to start now. Yet something about the moment felt different, like, for the first time in years, he was vulnerable. The emergency landing was anything but smooth. When the helicopter hit the ground, the jolt nearly sent Michael's head into the side of the cabin. The sound of the blades slowing mixed with the crunch of leaves and branches. Michael looked around, trying to make sense of their surroundings. "Are you all right?" he asked the pilot, who responded with a curt nod, as though words were an unnecessary luxury. Michael stepped out of the helicopter, feeling the uneven ground beneath his polished shoes. He turned to look at the aircraft, now motionless, like a wounded animal. "That wasn't normal," he muttered, more to himself than to the pilot. There was something odd about the way the engine had failed, something that didn't align with the standard of excellence he demanded from everything in his life. And Michael wasn't one to ignore anomalies. While the pilot inspected the controls, Michael walked around the helicopter. That's when he noticed something unusual, a small piece that seemed out of place. He wasn't a mechanic, but he knew enough to recognize when something wasn't right. "Was this like this before?" he asked the pilot, who frowned in confusion. "It shouldn't be," came the reply, only heightening Michael's suspicions. As minutes passed, Michael's initial unease hardened into an unsettling certainty. He had faced unexpected challenges before, but never something that felt this deliberate. "Was this sabotage?" he asked, his voice now laced with a seriousness that even the pilot couldn't ignore. The idea sounded absurd, yet it fit. Michael was a millionaire with many allies, but also enough enemies to make such a bold plan plausible. They were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a forest indifferent to the human drama unfolding within it. Michael pulled out his phone, but, unsurprisingly, there was no signal. He looked toward the horizon, realizing that whatever was happening wouldn't be resolved quickly. "This isn't a coincidence," he said to the pilot, his determination beginning to eclipse his fear. Something larger was at play, and as always, Michael wouldn't let it go unanswered. After the forced landing, Michael knew he couldn't afford to stand still. The helicopter was inoperable and his phone had no signal, but he wasn't the kind of man to succumb to panic. With the pilot's help, they managed to rig a makeshift distress call using the aircraft's emergency communication system. Though damaged, it emitted a basic signal that was picked up by a nearby rescue helicopter. Michael was flown back to the city with an expression that mingled frustration and steely resolve. The rescue flight was brief, but long enough for Michael to start crafting a plan. He was certain the incident wasn't a mere accident. Someone had deliberately put his life at risk, and that demanded a calculated response. Upon arriving in the city, he declined the offer of a luxury car to pick him up at the airport. Instead, he opted for a plane taxi, a rare move for someone of his status, but necessary to avoid drawing attention. He needed to move swiftly and discreetly. Michael wasn't the kind of man to leave questions unanswered. The moment he returned to the city, he drove straight to the corporate headquarters, ignoring the curious stares of employees who were surprised to see him arrive without his usual helicopter. As he ascended in the elevator, his mind raced with possibilities. Who stands to gain from this? He wondered. Being a millionaire meant there were always eyes on you, waiting for the right opportunity. On his way to his office, he crossed paths with Richard, who greeted him with his usual confident smile. "How was the trip?" Richard asked. Michael replied evasively, "Let's just say it was eventful." He wasn't ready to raise any suspicions, at least not yet. His immediate priority was to piece together what had happened, and more importantly, uncover who was behind the sabotage. Seated at his desk, Michael called the head of corporate security. The conversation was brief, but confirmed his suspicions. There were no recent maintenance reports indicating issues with the helicopter. Determined to dig deeper, he began reviewing the list of suppliers and contracts related to the aircraft. Every detail seemed like a potential clue, yet also a maze of information he would have to carefully untangle. Something didn't add up, and Michael was resolute in finding out what it was. As he pored over the documents, a nagging discomfort crept in. Michael had always trusted his team, but now every name on the list felt like a possible threat. It was an unfamiliar feeling for a man who prided himself on his ability to read people. Yet this incident bore a distinct signature, a blend of calculation and precision. that couldn't be ignored. For Michael, this wasn't just a technical problem, it was personal. Michael decided to focus on a specific lead that seemed the most promising: the technician who had worked on the helicopter. He knew that uncovering this individual's false identity was key to understanding what had happened. The head of security reported that the technician's recent activities showed ties to an external supplier who had recently signed a contract with the company. Michael felt he was finally closing in on something tangible. The contract in question appeared minor at first glance, but it contained an unusual clause that caught Michael's eye. It was the kind of detail that could easily be overlooked, but to someone with his trained instincts, it stood out like a beacon. He shared the discovery with his team, who confirmed that the supplier had no prior history of dealings with the company until a few months ago. Michael knew he needed to dig deeper into this connection. On a quiet afternoon, he asked the head of security to trace all communications related to the supplier. Among the records, there were emails hinting at rushed negotiations and approvals that bypassed standard procedures. Michael delved into the details, scrutinizing each message. The wording in the emails was vague, as if designed to obscure something, which only fueled his determination to uncover the truth. Richard, noticing Michael's intensity, suggested bringing in an external expert to review the evidence. "Sometimes a fresh perspective can reveal something we're missing," he said pragmatically. Michael agreed, but decided not to wait. He instructed his team to investigate any financial links between the supplier and the rival company mentioned earlier. For Michael, time was critical. He couldn't let this lead go cold. That night, as he reflected on everything he'd uncovered, Michael realized he was dealing with something far more significant than a simple act of sabotage. The precision of the events pointed to a meticulously planned operation, almost professional in its execution. He knew that to unravel the heart of this scheme, he would have to be even more methodical. Taking a deep breath, he steeled himself to follow every thread, even if it led to truths he'd rather not face. Michael felt he was getting closer to the truth, but the pieces of the puzzle still didn't fit perfectly. His focus remained on the suspicious supplier, whose ties to the company were more intricate than he had initially thought. A deeper analysis revealed that this supplier was involved in branch projects with costs significantly above market rates. The question was clear: why would someone approve such inflated expenses? To Michael, the answer wasn't negligence, it was deliberate. In a meeting with the head of security and his team, Michael discussed the next steps. They decided to investigate the individuals responsible for approving the contracts. 2 managers were directly tied to the process, both with years of service to the company. Michael didn't want to believe either could be involved, but he knew that the truth was non-negotiable. He instructed the team to interview both managers and examine their backgrounds for any unusual behavior. The first interview was uneventful. The manager seemed genuinely baffled at the idea of any wrongdoing. The second interview, however, was a different story. This manager was visibly nervous, giving short, evasive answers and avoiding eye contact. When questioned about the contracts, his explanations were vague and riddled with contradictions. For Michael, that was enough to set off alarm bells. The head of security conducted a thorough financial review of the second manager's background. What they uncovered was damning. Significant deposits into his account, all traceable to shell companies linked to the suspicious supplier. Michael scanned the reports, his frustration mounting. "So we have an inside collaborator," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. The discovery was a bitter blow, but also an important breakthrough. Armed with this new information, Michael decided to confront the manager directly. He called him into a private meeting, presenting the evidence methodically, almost ruthlessly. The man, cornered, tried to deny everything, but Michael's pressure broke him. Bit by bit, the manager admitted his role in the scheme, but claimed he had been coerced. According to him, the supplier had threatened to expose a personal secret unless he cooperated. It was a weak excuse, but it piqued Michael's curiosity. The manager's confession seemed to complete the puzzle, but something still didn't add up. Michael knew that despite his guilt, the manager didn't have the power or resources to orchestrate something this sophisticated. He was just a pawn in a larger game, and the mastermind remained in the shadows. This revelation gave Michael a fleeting sense of triumph, as though he were on the verge of solving everything. Little did he know, the real challenge was just beginning. As he reviewed the evidence with his team, Michael began to notice a troubling pattern. All the suspicious actions seemed carefully designed to lead him toward a specific conclusion. It was as if someone was manipulating the clues to craft a convenient narrative. This realization added a new layer of tension to the investigation. Michael no longer knew whom to trust, but he was determined not to be deceived. Richard, as always, was by Michael's side, helping him strategize the next steps. He suggested investigating other recently approved contracts to see if the scheme had been replicated elsewhere. Michael agreed, but decided to prioritize the branch where everything had begun. To him, this was the epicenter of the issue, and possibly the key to unmasking the true culprit. The investigation took an unexpected turn when one seemingly solid lead unraveled. The suspicious supplier had ceased operations weeks before the helicopter incident, meaning they couldn't have been directly involved. Michael was stunned by this revelation. Then who's really behind this? He asked himself, feeling as though all the progress he had made was slipping away. This false lead shook Michael's confidence. He realized the enemy was more cunning than he had anticipated, creating layers of distractions to complicate the investigation. But rather than demoralize him, it fueled his resolve. If they think they can outsmart me, they're underestimating the wrong person, he muttered, his determination reigniting. For Michael, giving up wasn't an option. He would see this through to the end. The next step was to redefine the strategy. Michael decided to revisit all the information with fresh eyes, discarding assumptions and starting from scratch. He knew that to win, he needed to think like his adversary. If I were trying to sabotage my own company, how would I do it? He asked himself. The thought was unsettling, but it was exactly the shift in perspective he needed to change the course of the investigation. As night fell, Michael remained in his office, surrounded by papers and screens flickering with data and charts. He was exhausted but more determined than ever. While scanning a list of names on the screen, something caught his attention, a connection he hadn't noticed before. His breathing quickened as the pieces began to realign. I think we're finally onto something, he said, a faint smile crossing his lips. But he knew better than to celebrate just yet. Michael wasn't the kind of man to ignore the signs. Over the past weeks, he had followed every lead, but the puzzle still felt far from solved. All evidence pointed toward Daniel, a trusted director who had been by his side in critical moments. Daniel seemed connected to the suspicious contracts and the logistics that had facilitated access for the problematic supplier. If it's him, I need solid proof, Michael thought as he sifted through the reports. Determined, Michael summoned Daniel for a private meeting. He meticulously prepared, gathering evidence that initially tied the director to the scheme. When Daniel entered the room, his expression showed surprise, but not nervousness. Michael began to lay out the irregularities he had uncovered. Daniel listened in silence, his hands clasped tightly, but his demeanor didn't immediately suggest guilt. Even so, Michael knew better than to trust appearances. These contracts have your signature, Daniel, Michael said bluntly, laying the documents on the table. He highlighted clauses and inflated costs that made no sense. Daniel picked up the papers, studying them carefully before responding. Yes, I approve them, but it was based on information provided by other departments, he said, his voice calm but defensive. Michael wasn't satisfied. To him, this sounded like an excuse, but he wasn't sure if Daniel knew the full scope of what he was caught up in. The confrontation continued. Michael pressed Daniel with more questions, while the director tried to justify each decision. Gradually, Daniel's explanations began to crumble. He admitted that in some cases, He had trusted reports from third parties without question. Michael realized that Daniel was just another piece of the puzzle, not the one orchestrating the game. Michael decided to end the meeting, instructing the head of security to keep Daniel under close watch and dig deeper into his claims. The investigation uncovered a critical detail. Daniel had been receiving instructions from an intermediary outside the company. The pattern was clear. Someone was using Daniel to push through the suspicious contracts without him realizing the true intent. This left Michael torn between frustration and determination. Meanwhile, Richard walked into Michael's office, bringing updates on recently reviewed contracts. "You need to see this," he said, placing the reports on the desk. Richard suggested expanding the investigation scope, looking beyond the initial branch to contracts in other areas of the company. "If this is as big as it seems, we can't focus on just one part of the problem," he said, his tone firm and loyal. Michael agreed, grateful for Richard's steady support. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was deliberately trying to manipulate him. The case against Daniel seemed too convenient, a perfect scapegoat to divert attention. "I'm dealing with someone smart but also calculating," he thought, mulling over his next steps. Behind the scenes, the head of security continued to investigate Daniel's connections. One detail stood out. The intermediaries mentioned in the emails were linked to a network of shell companies tied to one of Michael's longtime competitors. This confirmed the scheme was larger than it appeared. Daniel had been a tool, but the true culprit remained hidden in the shadows. Michael knew the game was far from over. Michael met with Daniel again, this time to extract more information about the intermediaries. Under pressure, Daniel revealed that he had received instructions directly from someone he didn't know personally, but who seemed to have insider knowledge of the company. They knew exactly how to avoid raising suspicions, Daniel said, bitterness evident in his voice. To Michael, this confirmed that the real perpetrator was closer than he wanted to admit. This revelation forced Michael to reassess his progress. He realized the clues had been deliberately laid to mislead him. Daniel's involvement was just one example. Someone was orchestrating the events with masterful precision. This isn't an ordinary adversary, Michael thought. He knew he had to outthink his opponent to reach the heart of the scheme. Richard remained a steadfast ally, managing the company's daily operations to give Michael the time and space to focus on the investigation. "Leave the rest to me," Richard said, his tone almost paternal. Michael, exhausted, accepted the offer without hesitation. Over the next few days, Michael began connecting the dots from a fresh perspective. He broadened the investigation, examining older contracts for similar patterns. During this process, he uncovered discrepancies that had previously gone unnoticed. This led to a disturbing realization. Someone wasn't just sabotaging the company, but was also crafting a narrative to obscure the truth. This insight only strengthened Michael's resolve. By the end of the week, Michael decided it was time to change tactics. He knew the real culprit was close, hidden behind layers of trust and appearances. His plan was simple: set a trap to force the person to reveal themselves. He organized a fake meeting, announcing that the case had been resolved and the company was ready to move forward. He hoped that the perpetrator, believing they were safe, would make a mistake. As Michael watched the reactions of those in the meeting, he knew the battle was far from over. He felt the weight of every decision, but also the urgency to protect everything he had built. This betrayal wasn't just professional, it was personal. And for that, Michael was prepared to go to any lengths. Little did he know, the game was about to change completely. Michael was exhausted but resolute. After weeks of relentless investigation, he finally felt he was closing in on the truth. The data continued to highlight connections between suspicious contracts and questionable internal decisions. Yet, something was missing. It felt as though the true culprit was expertly manipulating the pieces to remain hidden. If I were trying to cover something up, how would I do it? He wondered, searching for a fresh perspective. Among the reviewed contracts, a pattern began to emerge. The most irregular approvals were tied to a specific core of strategic decisions. Curiously, these decisions always involved Richard, though only indirectly. Richard's role appeared bureaucratic. He was the last to sign off, and his approval seemed routine. But Michael noticed something strange. Richard consistently signed these contracts right before leaving for business trips or during times when Michael was preoccupied. This struck him as odd. Michael revisited past schedules and meeting logs. He realized that on several occasions, Richard had urged him to focus on other projects while he handled smaller matters. This realization sent a wave of unease through him. Richard seemed to be deliberately creating distractions, something Michael had never noticed before. Is he trying to control what I see? He wondered, scrutinizing the data more closely. The confirmation came unexpectedly. The head of security presented records of communications between the suspicious intermediaries and a generic email address. When the IP address was traced, it showed that the account had been accessed from Richard's computer during off hours. For Michael, this was enough to raise definitive suspicion. But he knew he needed more evidence before taking action. He couldn't afford to make accusations without concrete proof. Michael decided to test Richard indirectly, gauging his reaction. In a casual meeting, he mentioned that he was close to identifying the culprit and that external auditors were now reviewing the contracts. Richard, usually composed and confident, showed a flicker of discomfort. He quickly changed the subject, suggesting that Michael shift his attention to other company matters. To Michael, this was another sign that Richard was involved. Following this interaction, Michael instructed the head of security to review older contracts signed by Richard. Once again, irregularities surfaced. Many of these contracts were tied to suppliers linked to the sabotage scheme. The evidence mounted to an undeniable level. Michael didn't want to believe it, but the truth was inescapable. Richard wasn't just a trusted ally. He was the mastermind behind the entire plot. Before confronting Richard directly, Michael meticulously gathered all the evidence. He wanted to ensure that nothing was left to chance. Contracts, email records, travel schedules, everything pointed to Richard's involvement. Yet, Michael couldn't ignore the mix of anger and sadness he felt. The idea that someone so close to him could betray him was hard to accept. But he knew he couldn't let emotions cloud his judgment. The confrontation was carefully staged. Michael asked Richard to stay behind after a routine meeting. Once the room cleared, Michael locked the door and laid the documents on the table. "I think you owe me some explanations," he said, his voice firm but measured. Richard looked at the papers with an air of calm, but Michael noticed a slight tremor in his hands. Richard was cornered, and they both knew it. "What exactly are you talking about?" Richard asked, trying to maintain composure. Michael pointed to the contracts and began detailing the connections he had uncovered. He highlighted the suspicious timing, the email records, and the decisions Richard had made. "All of this points to you," Michael said, his voice tinged with disbelief. Richard tried to deflect, but his justifications were weak. The tension in the room grew with every word. When it became clear there was no escape, Richard finally admitted it. "Yes, I did it," he said, his voice eerily calm. He explained his motivations, claiming that Michael's conservative decisions were stifling the company's growth. Working with a rival firm, Richard had orchestrated the sabotage of the branch to weaken Michael's position. To him, it was a necessary move. "I was protecting the future of the company," he said coldly. Michael felt a surge of anger mixed with profound disappointment. "Protecting the company?" he retorted. "You nearly killed me." He stepped closer to Richard, the weight of betrayal pressing down on him like a physical force. "I trusted you, Richard, more than anyone else." Richard didn't respond. He simply looked at Michael with a mixture of regret and defiance. The silence was the final confession. Michael felt as though the air in the room had grown heavier, making it difficult to breathe. His voice, once firm, now carried a note of pain he couldn't hide. "You were my rock, Richard. The one person I could count on when everything else seemed to fall apart. He took a step forward, his presence commanding the room. And now you're the one who tried to destroy me. The words came out as a sharp whisper, laden with a hurt he had never imagined he would feel. Richard stood still, but his eyes betrayed more than his calm exterior. It wasn't just regret. It was the weight of someone who knew there was no turning back. I did what I thought was right, he finally said, his voice unsteady yet still laced with an attempt to justify the unforgivable. You don't understand, Michael. I saw the company heading for disaster. You were so obsessed with control that you couldn't see what was happening. And your solution was to betray me? To put my life at risk. Michael took another step forward, his anger erupting like a storm held back for too long. You knew what this company meant to me, what we built together. And still you chose to throw it all away. He pointed at the documents on the table, as though they symbolized everything that had been broken. You didn't just destroy the company, Richard. You destroyed the only thing we had left, trust. Richard seemed on the verge of saying something but hesitated, as if he knew words would only make it worse. Michael pressed on, his voice now quieter but no less charged with emotion. Do you know what's cruelest about all of this? It's not what you did to me. It's what you did to yourself. You've become exactly what you always claimed to hate, a man who sells everything for power. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard lowered his eyes, unable to meet Michael's gaze. A tear threatened to escape Michael's eye, but he held it back. This wasn't the moment to falter. He glanced at the head of security, waiting just outside the door. You always told me to trust you, Richard, Michael said, his voice now almost a whisper. And I did. Maybe that's what hurts the most, that I trusted in something that never existed. He took a deep breath, drawing strength from within. And now? How do you justify this? How do you explain nearly taking my life in the name of saving a company? Richard looked up, and for the first time, his voice sounded genuine. I lost myself, Michael, he admitted, a softness in his tone that made him seem human again. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought it was the only way. Michael shook his head, unable to accept the excuse. You didn't lose yourself, Richard. You chose to lose yourself. You chose the easier, more selfish path. And now you'll face the consequences. The head of security stepped forward, ready to act. Michael raised a hand, signaling him to wait. He needed one more moment, not for Richard, but for himself. You know there's no way back, don't you? He said, looking at Richard as though searching for a fragment of the man he thought he knew. Everything you did, every decision, led to this moment. And now, there's no undoing it. Richard remained silent, but his eyes reflected a quiet resignation, as if he finally grasped the enormity of what he had done. Michael gestured to the head of security, who entered the room accompanied by 2 lawyers. It's over, Richard, Michael said with unyielding finality. You will be held accountable for all of this. As Richard was escorted from the room, Michael stayed behind, staring into the void as he tried to process what had just unfolded. When the door closed, Michael finally allowed himself to sit down. The room, now silent, felt as vast as it was empty. He looked at the scattered documents on the table, symbols of a betrayal he would never forget. Despite the anger and sadness, there was a sense of relief. He knew he had faced the truth and made the right decision, no matter how painful it had been. Michael sat for several long minutes, reflecting on what it all meant, for himself and for the company. It was more than just an act of betrayal. It was a stark reminder of how fragile and precious trust truly is, and how it must never be given lightly. In the end, he realized this wasn't just about Richard or the company. It was about him, about his ability to rise and carry on, even when everything seemed to crumble around him. Finally, Michael stood, took a deep breath, and looked out the window at the city skyline he had helped build. This won't destroy me, he said to himself with renewed determination. This will make me stronger. He knew the road to recovery would be long, but he was ready to face it, one step at a time. In the days following his confrontation with Richard, Michael felt as though he was navigating uncharted waters. The relief of uncovering the truth was overshadowed by the sting of betrayal. He knew he couldn't let this event define him, but the scars ran deep. The company will survive this, he repeated to himself like a mantra. Still, he understood that the real rebuilding had to start within. Michael gathered his core team for a meeting, deciding to be transparent about what had happened. He explained, without embellishment, that Richard had tried to sabotage the company, but that the plan had been uncovered and neutralized. The room was heavy with silence, not with anger, but with a shared resolve. "We're all here because we believe in what we've built," Michael said. "And that's what will drive us forward." As the company settled back into its routine, Michael methodically began repairing the damage. Contracts were scrutinized, internal processes were strengthened, and a culture of transparency was amplified. Despite everything, he realized there was an opportunity for growth in this crisis. Inspired by his leadership, the team worked harder than ever. The sense of overcoming adversity together created a bond unlike anything Michael had felt before. Yet, the nights were lonely. Michael often found himself sitting in his office, staring at the documents that had sealed Richard's fate. He wondered how someone so close could have betrayed him so deliberately. But he also came to understand that the blame didn't rest with him. Trusting people isn't the mistake, he thought. The mistake is ignoring the signs. This reflection helped him find a measure of peace amidst the turmoil. The experience with Richard also deepened his appreciation for those who had stood by him. Michael began to recognize the contributions of everyone on his team, from the executives to the most junior employees. "True wealth isn't just in what we build, but in who builds it with us," he said during a meeting. It was a lesson he would carry with him. Power meant little without loyalty and integrity. Michael realized his journey wasn't just about protecting what he had, but also about finding a greater purpose. He decided to dedicate part of his resources to creating a program for supporting small entrepreneurs, helping them avoid the pitfalls he had faced. To him, this was a way to turn the pain of betrayal into something that could positively impact others. "If this made me stronger, it can strengthen others too," he thought. Standing at the window of his office, looking out over the city, Michael felt a renewed sense of determination. He knew the scars from Richard's betrayal would never fully fade, but he also knew they were part of his story. "They remind me I'm human," he murmured. To Michael, that was what mattered most, moving forward, carrying the lessons learned, but refusing to let the past hold him back. In the end, Michael was no longer the man who had boarded that helicopter weeks ago. He had lost a friend, but found a new strength within himself. He had faced the deepest kind of betrayal and emerged more resilient. As the sun set on the horizon, he knew this wasn't the end of his journey. It was the beginning of a much stronger, wiser chapter. Michael's story reminds us that even in the face of the most painful betrayal, it's possible to find strength and purpose. How often do we place trust in those we think we know, only to discover that appearances can be deceiving? Yet Michael proved that it's not the falls that define us, but how we rise after them. What would you do in Michael's place? Would you forgive Richard despite everything, or move forward without looking back? More importantly, how do you manage trust in your own relationships? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective might inspire someone facing similar challenges. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss future chapters. We have many impactful stories like this one that showcase the human, vulnerable, and resilient side of life's greatest challenges. And before you go, check out the next video appearing on your screen now. I'm sure it will also resonate with you deeply and help you see new possibilities. Let's continue turning stories into lessons and inspiration together. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next story. Until then,